The moment Opal Fletcher stepped off the stagecoach in Harlan Creek, New Mexico Territory, in the autumn of 1883, she carried two things with her: a leather satchel stuffed with botanical sketches and the absolute certainty that she would not stay past spring. She had made that decision before the wheels of the coach had even stopped rolling, before the dust settled around her boots, before she had laid eyes on the sun-bleached Main Street with its crooked hitching posts and sagging storefront awnings. She had made it the way a woman makes a decision when she has been disappointed too many times by places that promised her something and then gave her nothing, quietly, firmly, and with the kind of resolve that leaves no room for argument. Harlan Creek was not where Opal had imagined herself at 24. She had imagined herself in Santa Fe, perhaps, or even back east where she had studied at the Women's College in Ohio before her mother took ill and her father's debts came due. But her cousin Hester had written her a letter saying there was work here, honest work as a school teacher, and that the town was decent enough, and so Opal had come. She would teach through the winter and through whatever passed for spring in the high desert, and then she would find her way somewhere else, somewhere that felt like a beginning rather than an ending. The first person to speak to her in Harlan Creek was not particularly impressive. He was leaning against the post of the general store with the ease of a man who had nowhere pressing to be, one thumb hooked in his belt, and his hat tipped just slightly against the afternoon glare. He was tall, broad-shouldered in the way that came from actual labor rather than simple size, with dark hair that curled a little at the back of his neck, where it escaped from beneath the hat brim. His face had been weathered by the sun into something honest and open, lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he either squinted often or laughed often, and Opal suspected from the general easiness of his posture that it was probably both. He looked at her with the particular kind of attention that was not rude but was definitely thorough. "You the new school teacher?" he asked. "I am," Opal said, adjusting the strap of her satchel. "Opal Fletcher." "Marshall Ramsey," he said, and pushed off the post to tip his hat in her direction. "Welcome to Harlan Creek, Miss Fletcher." "Thank you," she said, and meant it politely and nothing more. She found her cousin Hester within the hour, settled into the small house that had been provided for the schoolteacher at the far end of Cottonwood Lane. It was a modest place, 2 rooms, a fireplace, a window that faced west and caught the full force of the evening light, but it was clean and it was hers, at least for now. Hester helped her unpack the satchel and exclaimed over the botanical sketches, spreading them out on the table and asking about each one. Opal had been drawing plants and flowers since she was a girl, cataloging them in her careful, precise hand, and the sketches were some of the few things she had refused to leave behind when she packed. "You should see what grows out here," Hester said with enthusiasm. "All kinds of things. Marshall Ramsey's land has some of the most interesting desert plants I've ever seen. He's got a little spring on his property that keeps things growing that shouldn't grow this far west." "I met him briefly," Opal said, pinning one of her sketches to the wall beside the window. "He seems pleasant enough." Hester gave her a look that said she had noticed something in Opal's tone that Opal herself had not intended to put there. "He is a good man," Hester said simply. "One of the best in this county." Opal did not ask any more questions about Marshall Ramsey. She had not come to Harlan Creek to take an interest in good men. She had come to teach children their letters and their arithmetic, and to save enough money by spring to move on to wherever came next. She started school on the following Monday and found that she liked the children immediately, which surprised her a little because she had worried she might not. There were 14 of them, ranging from 6 to 15, crowded into the single schoolroom with its long wooden benches and its blackboard that had been repaired in one corner with a piece of painted wood that did not quite match. They were rough around the edges in the way that children in frontier towns always were, but they were curious and alive, and when she asked them what they already knew, their answers made her smile genuinely for the first time in what felt like months. She settled into a routine: school in the mornings and part of the afternoons, Long walks in the evenings when the light turned everything to copper and amber, and the desert smelled of sage and something sweet she could not yet identify. She had brought her botanical journals with her, and she continued her sketching, noting the plants she found around town and along the creek bed with the kind of careful attention that her college professor had once told her was better than most men he had taught. It was on one of these evening walks, about 2 weeks after her arrival, that she encountered Marshall Ramsey again. He was coming in from the eastern pasture on horseback, a big roan gelding that moved with a kind of lazy confidence that matched its rider. He saw her before she saw him, and he slowed the horse without making a production of it, just letting the animal settle into a walk as he came alongside the path she was following. "Evening, Miss Fletcher," he said. She looked up from the piece of creosote bush she had been examining. "Mr. Ramsey, you finding anything interesting?" She hesitated, because she was used to people asking that question in the tone that meant they thought it was a peculiar thing for a woman to be doing, crouching in the dust to look at plants. But his tone was genuinely curious, the same tone she had used herself when she asked her students what they knew, and so she answered honestly. "This creosote is remarkable," she said. "Some of them are thousands of years old. Did you know that? The same plant sending out new growth from its center for thousands of years." He looked at the scraggly bush with new eyes. "No, I did not know that." "Most people don't," she said, and stood, brushing the dust from her skirt. "I'm sorry, I don't mean to lecture." "I didn't mind it," he said. He swung down from the horse in one easy motion, which she noticed and then directed herself to stop noticing. "I'm headed back toward town if you want company on the walk, or I can leave you to your plants." She considered it. The evening was cooling and the walk back was longer than she had planned on. "Company would be fine," she said. They walked together at the horse's pace, which was slow and meandering, and she found that Marshall Ramsey was easy to walk beside. He did not fill silence with unnecessary talking, which she appreciated. When he did speak, it was to point out something along the path, a hawk circling high above the mesa, a tracks in the soft earth that he identified as a mule deer without any particular show of expertise, simply as a matter of fact. "How long have you been in Harlan Creek?" she asked. "Born here," he said. "Raised on the ranch my father built. Passed 6 years ago and left it to me." "You like it here?" He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man who takes questions seriously. "I do," he said. "I know some men want to be somewhere else. I'm not one of them." She nodded. She envied that, she realized, though she did not say so, the certainty of belonging somewhere. "What about you?" he asked. "You planning to stay in Harlan Creek?" She had not been asked this directly yet by anyone other than Hester, who already knew the answer. She was honest because she had decided early in life that small dishonesties compounded themselves into large problems. "I'll be here through the school year," she said. "But I expect I'll move on when spring comes." He nodded, and she could not read what he was thinking. "Where are you headed?" "I haven't decided yet," she admitted. "Somewhere. I have a restlessness in me that I haven't quite figured out how to settle." "Plants help with that?" he asked, nodding at her satchel with what was either mild amusement or genuine inquiry. She laughed a little. "Somewhat. They remind me that things grow where they're put, that things are adapted to their place." She paused. "I suppose I'm still looking for the place I'm adapted to." He looked at her then, just briefly, with an expression she could not entirely name. Then he turned forward again and did not say anything else about it. They reached the edge of town, and he wished her a good evening, and she walked back to Cottonwood Lane telling herself that Marshall Ramsey was simply a pleasant man who had been polite to the new schoolteacher, and that was all there was to it. She was not sure she believed herself, but she was not ready to examine why. October settled into November, and the days grew shorter, and the nights grew cold with a crisp, high-desert cold that was different from the damp cold she had known in Ohio, cleaner somehow, like breathing something that had never been breathed before. Opal wrapped herself in the heavy wool coat she had brought and went on with her routine, and tried not to think too much about what came next. She saw Marshall Ramsey with some regularity because Harlan Creek was not a large place and because, she gradually came to understand, he was one of those people that a community circles around without quite being aware of it. He was on the town council. He helped haul lumber for the new church addition without being asked. He knew every child in her schoolroom by name and would stop them in the street to ask them things he had heard from their parents, real questions that expected real answers. He treated the Mexican families who lived in the southern quarter of town, the Garcias, the Delgados, the Morales with the same straightforward respect he gave to everyone else, which she noticed because not everyone in town did the same, and she thought less of those who didn't. She also noticed the way his ranch hands spoke about him when they came into town on Saturdays, which was without the wariness or resentment that she had sometimes heard in the voices of men who worked for hard or unfair bosses. They spoke about him with the ease of people who were treated decently and knew it. She filed this away without consciously deciding to. The moment that complicated things, the first moment, she would think later, that she should have paid closer attention to came on a Thursday evening in mid-November when she was in the general store buying lamp oil. And she overheard two women from the Church Ladies' Society talking in the way that small-town women sometimes talk, which is to say freely, and with the assumption that the world ends at their elbow. "He's been alone since Clara passed," one of them was saying, and Opal recognized without quite wanting to that the subject was Marshall Ramsey. "Nearly 3 years now. Such a shame. They were a lovely match." "He doesn't seem to be looking," the other woman said. "I've introduced him to every suitable woman in the county." "He's particular," the first woman agreed. "Always was." Opal bought her lamp oil and left before she heard anything else. She told herself it was none of her business. She reminded herself she was leaving in spring. She went home and lit her lamp and opened her journal and drew a careful, detailed sketch of the creosote bush she had examined weeks ago, labeling each part with its proper name. When she got to the bottom of the page, she sat for a moment and then, without quite meaning to, she wrote in the margin in small letters, "Larkspur, columbine, and evening primrose." She had been thinking about flowers she wanted to see again. She had not seen larkspur since Ohio, and she missed it suddenly and fiercely in the way you miss specific beautiful things. She closed the journal and went to bed. The first serious event of the winter happened in late November, when one of her students, a boy named Eli Garza, 11 years old and bright as a new penny, came to school 3 days running with bruises on his wrists that he explained away too quickly. Opal was not a woman who ignored what her eyes told her. She talked to Eli alone after school on the 3rd day, gently and without accusation, and Eli, who was smart enough to understand kindness, eventually told her that his older brother Tomas, who was 16 and had taken to running with a rough group of older boys, had been coming home drunk some nights and was not careful with who was in his way. Opal thought about what to do with this information carefully. She did not want to make Eli's situation worse. She did not want to bring official attention to the family in a way that might bring other kinds of trouble, because she had seen how quickly official attention could turn ugly for Mexican families in frontier towns, and she was not naive about the dynamics at work in Harlan Creek. She went to see Marshall Ramsey. She did not entirely know why she went to him first rather than to the sheriff or to Hester or to someone else. She told herself it was because he knew the Garza family, and because he sat on the town council, and because he was the kind of person who seemed to know how to handle things without handling them badly. She left out of her reasoning the part where she had been thinking about him more than was probably wise for someone who had firmly decided to leave in spring. She found him at his ranch in the early evening, which was about 3 miles outside of town on a road that ran between dry hills covered in juniper. The ranch was larger than she had expected, a solid 2-story house built of adobe and timber, a good barn, several outbuildings, fences in good repair. There was a kitchen garden along the south wall of the house, mostly given over to winter dormancy, but with the structure of care still visible in the way The beds were laid out. Someone had planted that garden with intention, she thought. Someone had thought carefully about what would grow and where. She knocked on the door and Marshall answered it in his shirt sleeves with a book in his hand, which surprised her for reasons she found slightly embarrassing when she thought about it. She had not assumed he read. That was unfair of her, and she knew it. "Miss Fletcher," he said, and the way he said it had nothing surprised in it, as if her arriving at his door was a perfectly reasonable occurrence. "I need to talk to you about something," she said, "about one of my students." He stood aside to let her in. The inside of the house was comfortable and spare in equal measure. Good furniture, not fancy. A stone fireplace taking up most of one wall, burning well against the evening cold. Bookshelves that were actually used, she could tell, because the books were not perfectly arranged but worn and real. A painting on the wall above the mantel that she looked at twice, a New Mexico landscape done in soft, careful colors, better than amateur. She told him about Eli and about Tamaz, and about what she was worried would happen if it was handled badly. He listened with the focused attention she was beginning to associate with him, not interrupting, not dismissing. "I know the family," he said when she finished. "Their father works good land 2 miles east of here. He's a decent man. He doesn't know about Tamaz." "I didn't think he did," she said, "but I also don't want Eli to be in the middle of something he can't manage." Marshall was quiet for a moment. "I'll talk to Diego, that's the father, quietly, and I'll see about getting Tamaz some work. Sometimes a boy that age just needs something to put his hands to." She looked at him. "You do that." "He's a kid who's going sideways," Marshall said simply. "That's worth a conversation." She thought about the injustice that sat underneath all of it, the way boys like Tamaz got looked at in this territory, the way trouble was expected of them by the people who held authority, the way that expectation sometimes became a trap. She said some of this out loud, more than she had intended to, watching his face to see if he would close off at it. He did not close off. He nodded slowly. "You're right," he said, "and I won't pretend this town is fair to everyone in it because it isn't. I try to do what I can in my corner of it." "That's honest," she said. "I try to be," he said. She stayed longer than she had planned, because the fire was warm and he made coffee without making a ceremony of it, and they kept talking, about the town, about the students, about a drought the previous summer that had been hard on most of the ranches. At some point she looked up and realized the sky through the window was fully dark. "I should go," she said. "I'll ride you back," he said, and did not make it a question or a favor, just a plain statement of fact. He saddled the roan and rode beside her back to Cottonwood Lane, and she sat on the buckboard seat of his wagon. He had switched from the horse to the wagon so she could ride comfortably, and they talked the whole way, and she was back at her door before she was ready to be. "Thank you," she said at the door. "For the ride or for the help with Eli?" he asked. "Both," she said. "For both." He tipped his hat and turned the wagon around, and she stood on her doorstep until she could no longer hear the wheels on the road. And then she went inside and was very careful not to think too hard about anything. December arrived and brought with it the particular festivity of a small frontier town trying to make Christmas feel like Christmas, without most of the things that Christmas required. The women of the church organized a celebration that was ambitious in spirit if limited in material, and Opal was enlisted to help with the children's program, which she undertook with genuine enthusiasm. She had her students perform a small play about the Nativity that she had rewritten herself, because the version the church possessed was, in her professional opinion, both dramatically inert and educationally useless. The performance was held in the saloon, which was the largest indoor space in Harlan Creek, with the bar decorated with pine boughs cut from the hills, and the gaming tables pushed back against the wall to make room for benches. The whole town came. Even the people who did not generally go to church came, because the cold outside was significant and the saloon was warm and there was going to be spiced cider. Marshall was there, sitting near the back with the directness of a man who knows where he is and does not need to perform anything about it. He caught her eye before the performance started and nodded with what she read as encouragement, and she turned back to her students and directed them into their places with the particular calm authority she had discovered she possessed in front of a room full of people. The children were marvelous. Even the ones who forgot their lines recovered gamely, and the audience laughed in the right places and were moved in the right places. And when it was over, there was genuine applause that rang off the tin ceiling, and Opal stood at the side of the room and felt the specific pleasure of having done something well. Marshall appeared at her elbow with a cup of cider. "That was the best Christmas program this town has ever had," he said, "by some considerable distance." "You don't have to say that," she said, but she was smiling. "I'm not saying it to be polite," he said. "I'm saying it because it's true and because you looked like you were about to deflect any compliment I paid, and I wanted to be very clear beforehand." She looked at him with surprise and then laughed, a real laugh that came from somewhere uncomplicated. "You're very direct," she said. "Life's too short to be otherwise," he said. They stood together for a while in the warm room and drank their cider and watched the children chase each other between the adults' legs, and she was aware in a way she could not quite suppress that she was happy in a way she had not been in some time. She reminded herself about spring. She reminded herself about the restlessness that did not have an answer yet. She looked at Marshall Ramsey from the corner of her eye and reminded herself about all of it very firmly. He walked her home that night in the cold, and they could see their breath, and there was a moon that turned the desert silver. At her gate he paused. "Opal," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name, and it landed differently than she expected. The way a stone dropped into still water makes more disturbance than the size of it suggests. She looked up at him. "I don't want to complicate your time here," he said carefully, "but I'd like to spend more time with you if that's something you'd be willing to consider." She was very still for a moment. The moon was bright and his face was clear and honest, and she thought about what she had said to him on their first walk, about the restlessness, about looking for the place she was adapted to, and she thought about larkspur in Ohio and flowers she missed, and the schoolroom full of children who looked at her every morning with something that felt like trust. "I'm still planning to leave in spring," she said. It was the truest and most protective thing she could think of to say. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to change that. I'm just asking if you want to have a conversation by the fire sometimes." It was a modest request, framed with the kind of simplicity that she suspected was characteristic and not practiced. She thought of 100 reasons to say no. She could not in the end find one that felt honest. "All right," she said. He smiled at her then, a full real smile that changed his whole face, and said good night and walked back toward town, and she stood at her gate in the cold New Mexico moonlight and wondered what exactly she had just agreed to. It turned out she had agreed to a great many conversations by the fire and a great many evening walks and 2 more wagon rides, and one Saturday afternoon, when he showed her the spring on his property that Hester had mentioned, the one that kept things growing that shouldn't grow that far west. The spring was remarkable. It came up through a fold in the rock at the base of a low hill about a quarter-mile from the ranch house, feeding a pool that was no bigger than a parlor room, and around it grew things that were entirely wrong for the surrounding desert: green mosses and water plants, and a kind of tall grass that swayed in the slight wind coming off the hills. On the south-facing bank someone had once planted something, and it had gone to seed and planted itself in successive generations, and what was there now was a tangle of wild growth that she knelt beside for a long time trying to identify. "Someone planted this deliberately," she said, half to herself. "My mother," Marshall said, crouching beside her. "She brought seeds with her from Texas when she and my father came here. She said if there was going to be a spring on their land, it was going to have something beautiful around it." Opal looked at the tangle of wild growth and tried to imagine what it had looked like when someone first planted it with intention in a land that was new and unknown. "What did she plant?" "She told me once," he said, "but it's been a long time and the seeds have mixed. I never quite figured out how to tell them apart." She spent the better part of an hour sorting through the growth with the careful attention of someone who has spent years looking at plants with real focus. And she identified what she could: a type of violet that had gone completely feral, some kind of sedge, possibly the remnant of something that had once been planted as a kitchen herb. The rest had grown into its own thing, beautiful and ungovernable. She made something that could live without her, Opal said, finally sitting back on her heels and looking at it. That's a good thing to make. Marshall looked at her when she said that. She felt the look more than she saw it. They rode back to the ranch house, and she stayed for supper, which she had done twice before by this point without making a significant thing of it. And they sat across from each other at the table in the light of the lamp, and she watched him cut his bread and talk about the spring irrigation problem he was trying to solve before the snow melt, and thought about how strange and unreasonable it was to feel this comfortable with someone she had known for less than 3 months. "Tell me about where you want to go," he said. After spring. She was quiet for a moment because the question required honesty. "I told you I don't know," she said. "You have some idea," he said. "Or too precise a thinker to not have some idea." She looked at her plate. "Santa Fe," she said. "Or maybe further west, California possibly. There's a university in San Francisco that has a botanical department. I wrote them a letter last year, but nothing came of it." She paused. "Somewhere with a good library and enough work to keep me occupied and enough space that I don't feel like the walls are closing in." "Have you felt that way here?" he asked, and the question was measured, not anxious. She considered it honestly. "Less than I expected," she admitted. He nodded slowly and did not push further, and she appreciated both things: that he had asked the question, and that he did not push on the answer. She went home that evening with the feeling of something shifting inside her, small and definite, like the first crack in winter ice that means the thaw is coming. Christmas passed, and the new year of 1884 came in quietly, with a small gathering at the saloon that ended early, because 2 of the ranchers had to be up before dawn for various reasons, and everyone else was tired from the holiday. Opal sat with Hester and drank a glass of beer, which she had never had before in her life, and which was slightly less terrible than she had been led to believe. And at midnight she stepped outside for a moment and stood in the cold and looked at the sky that was absolutely crowded with stars. Marshall came out a few minutes later. He had not been looking for her, she thought, but he found her anyway. They stood together in the cold and looked at the stars and did not say anything for a long time, which was by now a comfortable thing between them, the silences that did not need to be filled. "Happy New Year," he said. "Happy New Year," she said. She looked at his profile in the starlight and thought about how his particular kind of steadiness was something she had not encountered in many people, and how it made her feel, simultaneously, more like herself and less like she had her footing. "Marshall," she said. "Opal," he said very quietly. "I'm still leaving in spring," she said. It came out softer than she had meant it to. "I know," he said. He was looking at the stars. "I know that." She did not say anything else, and neither did he, and after a while they went back inside. January was cold and contained, and she spent a great deal of it inside the schoolroom, where the fireplace worked hard against the wind that came down from the mountains. She drove herself into her teaching with the focus of someone who is trying to make something count, giving her students more than she had originally planned, going further and deeper into everything. She had Eli Garza reading at a level that surprised his father when he came in for the end-of-month meeting, and she watched Diego Garza's face change from polite attention to real pride and felt something lodge in her chest. Tomas Garza had, as Marshall had promised, found work on the Ramsey ranch. He came in with Eli a few times to pick up his brother, and he had the look of a young man who had found something to put his hands to, which is a particular kind of grounding look that cannot be faked. He nodded to Opal with a respect that told her everything she needed to know, and she nodded back with equal respect, and that was sufficient. She and Marshall had settled into something that was neither one thing nor the other, and was impossible to name precisely. They saw each other at least twice a week. sometimes more, and the conversations ranged across everything books and ranching, and the rights of women which were then under vigorous national discussion, and the treatment of the Pueblo people whose land this territory had been before it was anyone else's, and the nature of love, which they came to sideways and obliquely and never quite directly. They argued sometimes, fully and without pulling back, about things where they genuinely disagreed, and she found that she liked arguing with him because he took her seriously and did not change his position just to end the argument but also genuinely revised when she gave him a reason to. She was in love with him. She understood this clearly by the third week of January, sitting across from him at his kitchen table while he explained the mechanics of a windmill he was planning to install for the spring water system, and she had the sensation of stepping off something she had not seen the edge of. She did not tell him. She packed the knowledge away very carefully in the same box where she kept everything she was not ready to act on, and she went home and sat by her own fire and had a firm conversation with herself about spring in California and the university botanical department. The conversation did not go as well as usual. February arrived with a late storm that dumped more snow on Harlan Creek than anyone expected and closed the school for 4 days. Opal was stuck inside on the first day, watching the snow come down and feeling the walls that she had said were not closing in begin to feel a little closer than she preferred. By the second day, she put on every layer she owned and went outside and walked to the edge of town and then further, out along the road to the eastern pastures. She did not tell herself she was walking toward Marshall's ranch. She was just walking. She arrived at the ranch about an hour later, cold and slightly snow-damp in places where her coat was not quite adequate, and she knocked on the door and he opened it and looked at her with an expression that shifted through several things quickly: concern, warmth, something else she did not examine too closely, and then he stepped aside to let her in. "You walked here in a storm," he said. "I was going stir-crazy," she said, and shed her coat. He made her sit by the fire and brought her a blanket and hot coffee and then sat down across from her and looked at her for a long moment. "I need to tell you something," he said. She looked up. "I am aware of what you told me at the beginning," he said carefully in the tone of a man who has been thinking about how to say something for some time. "That you're leaving in spring. I have not forgotten it and I am not going to pretend I have." He paused. "But I would not be honest with you if I did not tell you that I think about you a great deal. He stopped, started again. "I care about you, Opal. I care about you in a way that I have not cared about anyone in a long time." She looked at the fire because looking at him was too much. "I know that may not change anything," he said. "I'm not asking it to. I didn't want to let you leave here without you knowing that. Whatever you decide to do with it." She sat very still in the chair with the blanket around her and the fire warm on her face and thought about everything she had packed into the box that she was not ready to open. She thought about larkspur in California and the restlessness that was supposed to be driving her somewhere. "Clara," she said, "your wife." The name sat between them for a moment. "She was wonderful," he said, simply and without distress. "She died of a fever in the spring of 1881. She was 26. He looked at his hands. "I don't talk about her often, but I don't keep her secret. She was real and she mattered and she would have liked you, I think." "Why?" Opal asked. "Because you are honest and particular and you know things," he said. She valued those things. Opal looked at him then and said nothing, and he said nothing, and the storm came down outside and the fire burned and something that had been wound very tightly in her chest began to loosen without her permission. "I care about you too," she said. "I have for a while." He looked at her. "I still don't know what that means," she said. "About spring, about what I'm going to do. I told you I was leaving and I meant it when I said it." "I know you did," he said. "I still feel the restlessness," she said. "I don't know if this place is where I'm adapted to be. I don't know how to know that yet." "I'm not asking you to know it yet," he said. "I'm not asking you anything, I just wanted to be honest." She nodded slowly. The fire popped and settled. "Come look at this," he said, and stood and went to the bookshelf and came back with a book that was worn nearly to pieces, a botanical survey of the Southwestern Territories, published in 1870 that she had not known existed. He put it in her hands. She opened it, and the pages were dense with exactly the kind of information she had been chasing through various inadequate sources for 3 years. She looked up at him. "Where did you get this?" "I ordered it from a bookseller in Santa Fe when I heard you talking about your plant work," he said, with the directness that was not a performance. "About 2 months ago. I thought you'd want it." She looked back down at the book and her vision blurred slightly and she blinked it clear and concentrated on the text. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was entirely level. "You're welcome," he said, and sat back down and let her read. She read for the rest of the afternoon, while the storm continued outside, and he read his own book, and occasionally one of them said something to the other about what they were reading, and the lamp was lit as the light faded, and eventually she looked up and realized she had not thought about leaving even once in the last 4 hours. The storm ended, and she stayed another day, sleeping in the spare room because the road back to town was not yet clear, and woke up to the ranch in snow that turned the whole world quiet and clean and white. She stood at the window of the spare room in her stockinged feet and looked at the land covered in snow and thought about roots. About the creosote that was thousands of years old. About Marshall's mother planting seeds by a spring in a place that was new and unknown. She did not make any decisions that morning, but she felt something change in her, quiet and definite, like the first crack in ice. March arrived, and with it the first hints of warmth in the days, cold still at night, but afternoons that smelled like something waking up. Opal's students felt it and grew restless in the way that children do when spring is coming, and she let them outside when she could and taught them the names of the plants coming up through the last of the snow at the edge of the creek, which was both botany and something else she could not quite classify. She had still not said anything more to Marshall about leaving. She had not said anything more about staying. The thing between them had settled into a particular shape, tender and careful, and not quite named, and she was aware of both its beauty and its impossibility simultaneously, which was not a comfortable thing to carry. One afternoon in the second week of March, she was at the general store when she overheard. She seemed to overhear a great many things in general stores. The storekeeper's wife talking to another woman about how the new schoolteacher from back east would be leaving when the school year ended, because that was always what the young women did. They came for a year and then moved on. Opal bought her flour and her lamp oil and walked home and stood in her 2-room house on Cottonwood Lane and looked at the sketches she had pinned to the wall. The botanical survey Marshall had given her was on the table beside her journals, which had grown fat with 3 months of new observations. There was more information in those journals than she had collected in 2 years prior to coming here. She looked at the west window that caught the evening light and thought about the garden along the south wall of Marshall's house, dormant through winter and beginning now to show the first tentative green. She had been walking past some of the more difficult feelings, she realized. She had been treating her own heart with the same determined forward momentum with which she treated everything else. She had been so busy going somewhere else that she had not fully noticed where she was. She sat down at the table and opened her journal to a new page and wrote at the top, "What is keeping me here?" She sat with the question for a long time. Then she wrote, "What is drawing me away?" She sat with that longer. She closed the journal and put on her coat and walked to Marshall's ranch. He was in the barn when she arrived, working on something with the easy practical focus of a man in a familiar space. He looked up when she came in and straightened and waited. "I need to ask you something," she said. "All right," he said. "If I stayed," she said. I'm not saying I'm staying, but if I did, what would that look like to you?" He looked at her steadily. "That would depend on what you wanted it to look like," he said. "That's not an answer," she said. "It's the honest answer," he said. "Because I don't want to tell you what it looks like and have you feel like you're fitting yourself into a picture someone else drew." She looked at him for a long moment. He was holding a wrench, and his shirt sleeves were rolled up, and there was a smear of grease on his right forearm, and he looked at her with the particular clear attention that she had come to understand was simply how he looked at things he cared about. "I have been telling myself I'm leaving since the moment I got off the stagecoach," she said. "I said it so early and so firmly that I stopped noticing whether it was still true." He was very still. "I don't think it's still true," she said. "I think I have been looking for the place I'm adapted to, and I have been so focused on looking forward that I did not notice I had already found it." She stopped. "I think I found it in October, possibly. I'm not certain of the exact date." Marshall set the wrench down on the workbench very carefully. "Opal," he said. "I'm not entirely certain this is wise," she said, because she had never been the kind of person who arrived at conclusions without acknowledging their complications. "I am a woman who does not like to be confined, and I have a lot of ideas about what I want to do with my life, and I am not interested in becoming a lesser version of myself for anyone. And I still have the restlessness. I don't think that goes away." "I know," he said. "I have never once wished for you to be different than you are. And I have been very clear that I was leaving," she said. "You have been admirably consistent," he agreed, and something in his voice had warmth in it, the beginning of something that was about to be larger. "I am not certain I am making the right decision," she said. "Neither am I," he said. "I don't think certainty is available on this particular question. I think you just have to decide anyway." She looked at him. "I'm staying," she said. He crossed the barn to her in 3 steps, and he stopped close enough that she could see the lines at the corners of his eyes very clearly, and he took her hands in both of his. "Good," he said, and his voice was rough with something controlled. "That's good." She looked up at him, and he bent toward her, and she went up on her toes, and they kissed in the barn with the smell of hay and horses around them, and the March light coming through the high windows, and it was honest and warm and unhurried, like him. And like everything she had found in this place, she had not expected to stop. They stood together for a long time afterward, her head against his shoulder, his hand in her hair, and the horses moved quietly in their stalls, and the light changed as the afternoon wore on, and neither of them felt any particular urgency about speaking. "I will still be restless sometimes," she said into his shirt. "I know," he said. "I will have opinions that you don't always share," she said. "I know that too," he said. "I have opinions you don't always share. We argue about them and then we figure out what's true. That's fine. And I want to pursue my plant work seriously," she said, "not just as a hobby." He pulled back enough to look at her. "Opal," he said. "I gave you that botanical survey 2 months ago because I wanted you to have the best resource available. What exactly do you think I've been trying to communicate this whole time?" She laughed, and the laugh felt like something opening. "I wanted to be clear," she said. "You are always clear," he said. "It is one of the things I love most about you." She was quiet for a moment, feeling the weight of that word in the air between them. "I love you," she said, testing the shape of it, finding it fit. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something undefended and very real. "I love you," he said. "I have for a while, since about November, I think." "I was at least a month ahead of you," she said. He laughed at that, and she liked the sound of it very much. They were careful about it for a while after that. There was the matter of the town and its opinions, and the children she was teaching, and the fact that they were both private people who did not feel the need to perform anything in public. But they were not secret about it either, because secrecy would have been dishonest, and they were both, at their cores, honest people. The town noticed. The town had opinions. Most of the opinions were positive, particularly among the people who had liked Marshall and worried about him being alone, and had also decided they liked the schoolteacher. A few of the opinions were of the variety that believed a woman had no business being as educated and independent as Opal presented herself, and those opinions she was familiar with and addressed when necessary and otherwise declined to let govern her life. There was one genuine complication, which arrived in the form of a letter that Opal received in late March from the university in San Francisco. They had a position available, the letter said, for a botanical researcher to assist with a survey of native plant species in the California territories. They had received her earlier letter and had kept her name on file and now wondered if she might be interested. She sat with the letter for a long time, then she took it to Marshall. She showed it to him without any preface, just handed it over when she arrived at the ranch that evening. He read it with the care he gave to everything and then looked up. "That's what you were looking for," he said. There was no accusation in it. "It's one version of it," she said. "Yes." He handed it back to her. "What do you want to do?" She looked at the letter. She thought about California and the university and the work. She thought about 14 children in a schoolroom who were reading better than their parents had at the same age. She thought about the spring on Marshall's land and the botanical survey with its margins she had already begun to fill with her own notes, and the desert that had already given her more material for her journals than the previous 2 years combined. She thought about the south wall garden that was beginning to come up green. "I want to write back to them," she said slowly. "I want to tell them about my work here, about what I've been documenting. I want to ask if there is a version of this that doesn't require me to go to California." He looked at her. "I don't know if they'll want that," she said, "but I think I should ask." "That sounds right," he said. "And if they say it has to be California," she said, "then I will need to have a more difficult conversation." "Yes," he said, "we would." She looked at him across the table with the lamp between them. "I'm not a woman who will sacrifice everything she wants for a man," she said. "I need you to know that." "I know that," he said. "I have always known that, and I would not want you to." "Even if it meant I chose California," she said. He held her gaze for a long, steady moment. "I would rather you be fully yourself somewhere else than half yourself here," he said. "That is what I would want for you. But I will tell you honestly that I am hoping very much that there is a third option." She wrote the letter. She was honest in it about her situation and her work and what she had been doing and what she hoped to do, and she asked, carefully but plainly, whether there was a way to contribute to their botanical research from the New Mexico territory, where she had already been documenting native species for several months. She sent it, and then she tried to be patient about the waiting, which was not her strongest attribute. Spring came to Harlan Creek in April with the particular suddenness of the high desert, which goes from winter to explosion with very little hesitation. Things bloomed that had not been visible for months. The creek ran full with snowmelt, and the willows along its bank went green practically overnight, and the cottonwoods put out their leaves in a rush of pale gold green that lasted about 4 days before settling into summer. And in the front bed of Marshall's kitchen garden, where all winter there had been only bare earth, something began to come up that she had not expected. She noticed it on a Sunday afternoon in the second week of April when they were working in the garden together. She had taken to helping him with the kitchen garden because it gave her both botanical data and the physical satisfaction of her hands in soil. She was weeding the far end and he was at the other end, and she nearly walked past it before the specific shape of the seedling stopped her. She crouched down. She looked at the tiny plants with the precision of someone who had been drawing botanical specimens for 10 years. "Marshall," she said. He said, not looking up. "What did you plant here?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he set down his trowel and came to crouch beside her. The seedlings coming up in the front bed were small but unmistakable to her trained eye: larkspur, she thought, and columbine, and the thin feathery beginnings of what was going to be evening primrose. She looked at him. He looked at the seedlings. His expression was the particular expression of a man who has done something and is prepared to have an opinion about it from the person he did it for. "In November," she said slowly, "I came to see you about Eli. We talked for a long time, and I said—" She stopped. She thought about what she had written in the margin of her journal that night, half thinking of him. "I said I missed larkspur. I mentioned columbine. I said something about evening primrose and the way it smelled." "You did," he said. She looked at the seedlings. She looked at him. "I mentioned them once," she said, "in passing. While we were talking about the creosote bush and the nature of things that grow where they are put. I said them almost to myself." "I know," he said. "I wrote them down when I got home." He paused. I ordered the seeds from a catalog. They arrived in January. I didn't know if they would take in this soil, but I thought it was worth trying." She sat back on her heels in the garden bed and looked at him and felt something happen inside her that was very large and very quiet simultaneously. He had listened to something she said in passing. He had written it down. He had spent 3 months trying to grow something beautiful for her in a place where it might not grow, just because she had said once, almost to herself, that she missed it. She reached out and took his hand. "You planted larkspur," she said, "and columbine and evening primrose," he said. "I wasn't sure about the evening primrose. The catalog said it would need particular attention in this climate." "It will," she said. She was still looking at him. "It needs good water and the right light." "I know," he said. "I've been thinking about where to move it once it's established." She thought about the spring he had shown her in October, the one on the fold in the hill with the water that kept things growing that shouldn't grow that far west. "By the spring," she said, "on the south-facing bank, there's already moisture there." He nodded. "That's what I was thinking." She was quiet for a moment, feeling the weight of all of it. The larkspur, the January seed catalog, the south-facing bank of the spring. The man in front of her who had listened to her say something in passing and had gone home and written it down. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said. She leaned forward and kissed him in the garden with the April sun warm on their backs and the smell of turned earth and the tiny larkspur seedlings bright green in the bed before them. The letter from San Francisco arrived in the 3rd week of April. It was not the answer she had hoped for and not the answer she had feared. They were interested in her field documentation, the letter said, and believed her New Mexico work had genuine value. They could not offer her the full position from a distance, but they proposed a collaboration. She would continue her systematic documentation of native species in the New Mexico territory and submit quarterly reports to their research office, and they would include her work in their survey publications with proper attribution. It was not a salary, they acknowledged, but it was formal recognition within the scientific community, which she understood had its own particular value. She read it 4 times and then went to Marshall with it. He read it and looked up. "What do you think?" he asked. "I think it is not everything I wanted," she said honestly, "but it is something real. And I think that if my work is good enough, more may come of it." She paused. "I think I would be a fool to refuse it." "I think so too," he said. "I will write back and accept the collaboration," she said, "and I will keep documenting." She looked at him. "There is enough here that I haven't fully understood yet. The spring alone could sustain a full botanical study. The diversity in this territory is remarkable." He was smiling. "What?" she said. "You sound like you're planning to stay for a while," he said. She looked at him and felt the truth of it settle through her like warm water. "I believe I am," she said. He proposed to her on a May evening by the spring, while the larkspur they had transplanted from the garden bed was beginning to establish itself in the South Bank's good moisture, and the evening primrose was putting up its first flower buds, and the light on the water was the particular gold copper of the New Mexico evening that she had been drawing in her journal for months. He did not kneel because he was a practical man, but he took both her hands and looked at her with the undefended expression she had learned to read, the one that was his version of completely open, and he said, "I would like to spend my life with you, Opal. I would like to watch you fill every journal you own and then order you more. I would like to argue about things we disagree on and be shown when I'm wrong. I would like to make a home with you that is yours as much as it is mine." He paused. "If you'll have me." She looked at him and thought about October, about stepping off a stagecoach with a leather satchel and a firm decision. She thought about the restlessness and where it had gone, not away, she realized. It had not gone away. It had just finally found a direction, and the direction was forward rather than elsewhere, deeper rather than onward, and the ground under her feet was specific and known and good. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." He kissed her with the spring running quietly beside them and the evening coming on and the flowers growing in the soil of a place she had not meant to stay. They were married in June, in the church with the repaired addition, which now had a full new wall that Marshall had personally helped to build. The whole town came, including the Garza family, with Tomás standing straight and proud in the borrowed good coat that Diego had pressed carefully for the occasion. Hester cried before the service had even begun, and did not appear to be embarrassed about it. Opal wore a dress she had ordered from Santa Fe, cream-colored cotton, with tiny flowers embroidered at the collar, which Hester had done herself over the course of 3 weeks, and had not told Opal about until the morning of the wedding when she unwrapped it from its paper, and Opal had to sit down for a moment because it was so unexpectedly beautiful. She walked down the aisle of the church with her arm through Hester's, because her parents were far away, and Hester was who she had here, and that was exactly right. Marshall stood at the front of the church in his good jacket, and his expression when he saw her was one she knew she would be able to draw from memory for the rest of her life, completely unguarded, like a man who has been given something he was not fully sure he deserved, and is not going to spend a single second pretending he isn't grateful for it. They said their vows, and the whole church was very quiet and warm, and the light came through the windows in long late afternoon shafts, and Opal thought about the margin of her journal from the previous October, and about larkspur growing by a spring in the desert, and about how certainty was apparently not required before you arrived at something true. The celebration afterward was the kind that small frontier towns do best, which is loud and warm and inclusive, and going well past the time anyone had planned on. The saloon was full, and there was music from a fiddle player Marshall had apparently known since childhood, and someone had made a cake that was ambitious and slightly imperfect and perfect. Opal danced with Marshall twice, and once with Eli Garza, who was an extremely serious dancer, and once with old Diego Garza, who was not serious at all and was wonderful, and she laughed more that evening than she could remember laughing in a long time. They moved into the ranch together that night, and she had already, over the previous weeks, been slowly integrating her things, her books and journals and sketches, her botanical specimens preserved carefully between sheets of blotting paper, the botanical survey with its dense marginal notes. The house absorbed her presence the way a good house absorbs the people who love it, without resistance, with a kind of readiness. She kept teaching. She had requested to continue the school year, and the town council, largely because Marshall had said it would be an absurdity to lose the best teacher the school had ever had simply because she had married, agreed that she could continue as long as she wished to. She intended to teach through the following year at least, until she understood what the collaboration with San Francisco was going to require of her time. Summer on the ranch was full and demanding, and she fell into the rhythms of it with a surprise at how well she adapted. Not because she had expected to be bad at it, but because she had expected it to feel like something she was learning rather than something she was discovering she already knew. She was good with the kitchen garden. She was good with the accounts, which had been managed adequately but not brilliantly by a neighboring ranch wife who had helped Marshall after Clara passed. She was good at knowing when to work alongside Marshall and when to leave him to the particular solitary focus that certain ranch tasks required. And she worked, she documented. She filled her journals with the summer desert, the blooms she had not seen in spring, the insects and their relationships to the plants, the way the spring on the hill changed through the hot months as the snowmelt slowed and the water level dropped. She wrote detailed reports and sent them to San Francisco, and received letters back from a researcher named Dr. Adela Hartman, who was the first woman she had corresponded with who treated her botanical observations as data rather than curiosity. The correspondence became something she looked forward to each month with real keenness. The larkspur by the spring bloomed in its first summer, a bright, unlikely blue that should not have been there in that desert landscape and was perfect precisely because of that. She stood in front of it for a long time on the morning it opened, and then she went back to the house and told Marshall. He came out with his coffee, and they stood together and looked at the blue flowers in the desert morning. "Your mother would have liked this," she said. "She would," he said. She'd have asked you the Latin name and argued about whether it was really the right variety. Opal smiled. It is the right variety. I know, he said. You just corrected me preemptively. She laughed and took his arm, and they stood until the sun got too high to be comfortable. In September of 1884, she realized she was pregnant, which she discovered gradually rather than suddenly, because she was a woman who paid attention to her own body with the same precise attention she gave to everything else. She told Marshall on a Tuesday evening after supper, setting down her fork and looking at him across the table and saying plainly, "I believe I'm going to have a baby." He looked at her. His expression moved through surprise and then something deeply real, warm and slightly undone, and he put his hand over hers on the table. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am very well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, otherwise entirely well." "And how do you feel about it?" he asked. She had been expecting a different question, she realized. Not the practical one, but this one, which was the important one. She thought about it honestly. "I feel like it is the right thing at the right time," she said, "which I did not fully expect to feel, but I do." He raised her hand and kissed it. She kept teaching until December, when the mornings became difficult enough that she decided to hand the classroom over to a young woman from a neighboring town who had been looking for a position. She was not entirely happy about this, but she was realistic, and she told herself it was temporary. She told her students the same thing, and accepted their somewhat disorderly expression of feeling about the situation with equanimity and a degree of genuine emotion. She did not stop her botanical work. She wrote her San Francisco reports through February with the particular concentrated focus of a woman who knows her time is going to become more constrained and is therefore determined to use it well. Their son was born in March of 1885, on a morning that came in clear and cold after 3 days of rain, and he arrived with his father's coloring and his mother's expression, which was to say, alert and opinionated from the first moment. They named him Jonas, after Marshall's father, and Opal held him in the morning light by the west window and felt something that had no adequate language. Marshall sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, and then at his wife, and his face had the same completely undefended quality that she had first seen the day she walked into the barn and told him she was staying, except more so, further in, deeper. "Hello, Jonas," Marshall said, in the particular quiet voice of a man who is addressing something very important. "I'm your father. Your mother is remarkable. I want you to know that right from the start." Opal laughed even though her eyes were full of water. Spring came back to Harlan Creek that year with the same desert suddenness as the year before, and the larkspur by the spring came back without anyone planting it again, because it had established itself truly now, rooted in the good moisture of the South Bank. And there was more of it than the year before, the colony spreading along the bank in a line of improbable blue. The columbine came up too, delicate and certain, and the evening primrose put out its first flowers in the late afternoon when the light was good. Opal brought Jonas to see them when he was 6 weeks old, bundled against the remaining cold, and stood at the spring in the April light, and showed him the flowers with the narrating thoroughness of a woman who had spent years putting names and meanings to beautiful things. Delphinium, she told him, which was the Latin genus of the larkspur. Aquilegia, which was the columbine. He was not able to process this information, but he looked at her with the alert, opinionated expression that was already recognizably his own, and she counted that as sufficient. Marshall came up behind her and put his arm around her and looked at the flowers too. "She told me she would be gone by spring," he said against her hair. She turned to look at him. "That's what you told me in October," he said. "When I asked how long you were planning to stay, you said you'd be gone by spring." She looked at the larkspur. She thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach with a leather satchel and a firm decision and the absolute certainty of her own departure. "I lied," she said. "You didn't," he said. "You meant it when you said it." "Then I changed my mind," she said. "People do," he said, "when they find something true." She leaned into him and Jonas made a small sound between them. the particular sound of a person who has opinions about everything, even at 6 weeks, even when those opinions are not yet fully formed into language. She thought about California and about the botanical department, and about the letter she had written from a place of restlessness, still running towards something she had not yet found. She thought about how far she had been prepared to go to find the thing that had been here, in the desert, by a spring with improbable flowers, and a man who listened when she spoke and wrote down what she said. She had sent her most recent quarterly report to San Francisco 3 weeks ago, and Dr. Hartman had written back with more enthusiasm than any previous letter, saying that the New Mexico documentation was the most comprehensive field survey they had received from any non-institutional researcher, and asking whether she had given thought to a more formal research appointment. The question was still open on her desk, to be answered when she had thought about it carefully enough. She would answer it. She would figure out what was possible and what was not, and she would do it with the clear-headed directness that was her nature. She was not finished with any of the things she had come here carrying. The curiosity and the ambition and the restlessness were all still hers, still alive, still pushing her forward. They had not been replaced by anything. They had just been given a place to be. That was what she had been looking for. Not stillness. Not an end to the looking. Just a place to look from, a place that was hers, ground that was specific and known. She had found it in the last place she had expected. In a town she had chosen by default. In a house she had not imagined. With a man who had planted larkspur from a seed catalogue, because she had said once, in passing almost to herself, that she missed it. The summer of 1885 passed, and the fall came, and the school opened again with Opal back at the front of the classroom, which her students received with a collective expression of satisfaction that she found more gratifying than she was willing to admit out loud. Jonas stayed with a neighbor in the mornings, and Marshall brought him to the school at lunchtime so she could feed him, which became a daily arrival that the older children in particular appeared to feel some proprietary interest in. The formal research appointment that Dr. Hartman had raised in her letter turned out to be something that could be conducted entirely by correspondence, with an annual visit to San Francisco for collaborative review. The visit Opal negotiated carefully to the spring, when the desert was in its best season, and she could leave it for 2 weeks without missing the documentation window she needed. Marshall agreed to this arrangement with the same straightforward support he had given everything she pursued, which was not nothing. She knew enough women whose ambitions had been quietly pruned back by marriage to understand that it was in fact everything. She made her first visit to San Francisco in the spring of 1886, leaving Jonas with Marshall and Hester and her students' families, who formed a cooperative care arrangement with the organized enthusiasm of people who liked the schoolteacher very much. She was nervous about being away from both her son and her husband for 2 weeks, which she had not entirely anticipated, and which told her something about how completely this place had become hers. But the visit was important and productive, and Dr. Hartman was exactly what her letters had suggested: sharp, serious, brilliant on the subject of native plant ecology, and generous with a younger researcher in the way that the best scientists are. They spent 2 weeks going over Opal's documentation and planning the next year's work, and Opal came home with a head full of new questions and a clearer sense of the direction of her research than she had ever had. She came home to Harlan Creek on a late April evening with the desert in its best gold-copper light, and Marshall standing on the station platform with Jonas on his arm, and Jonas, who was 13 months old and deeply interested in everything, lunged toward her the moment he saw her in the way of a person who has an extremely direct relationship with his own emotions. She took him and held him and looked at Marshall over Jonas's head. "Good trip?" he asked. "Very good," she said. "Come home and I'll tell you everything." They drove back to the ranch in the wagon, and she told him everything, which took most of the journey and part of the evening. He listened with the focused attention that was still, after almost 3 years, something she had not stopped appreciating. He asked the right questions. He said at the end of it, "So this work is going to go on for a while." "For a long while," she said. "The territory alone could sustain a decade of documentation if I do it properly." "Good," he said. "You say that very easily," she said. He looked at her. "Of course I do," he said. "It's important work, it's your work. Why would I say anything else?" She looked at him and thought, not for the first time, that the universe had been extremely generous with her in the matter of this particular man. Jonas went to sleep and they sat together by the fire in the late evening, and she showed him the new notes from San Francisco, and he read them with genuine attention, and asked about 3 things she had not thought to explain, good questions that sharpened her thinking. And she thought about how she had worried, before she knew him well, that this place and this life would mean the smaller version of herself. The version of herself she was at 30 was larger than the version she had been at 24, stepping off a stagecoach with a firm decision about departure. It was larger in every direction, more knowledgeable, more purposeful, more rooted, more willing to love without running the full calculation of cost first. The restlessness was still there, pointing her forward into the next year's research and the year after that, and the questions that Dr. Hartman had opened up in San Francisco. But it had direction now. It had a place to come home from and come home to. Spring came again the following year, and the larkspur by the spring was magnificent. The colony had spread further along the bank, a wide swath of blue that did not belong in the desert by any rational botany, and was there anyway, insisting on itself in the thin soil that Marshall's mother had once told him would grow anything if you believed in it hard enough. Opal documented it every year. She had 6 pages of careful sketches of the larkspur colony by the spring, showing its expansion and its variations, and it was part of a paper she was working on about non-native species adaptation in high desert environments, which she intended to submit to an Eastern botanical journal later that year. She was also, in the spring of 1887, expecting their second child, which she had told Marshall on a February evening with the same plainness as the first time, and he had responded with the same question, "Are you all right? How do you feel about it?" which she had stopped expecting to be surprised by and was surprised by anyway, a little. She was very well and she felt it was right again, and this time she already knew what she was moving into, which made everything different in the way that doing a thing the second time is always different. Their daughter was born in November of 1887, small and certain, and absolutely furious about the entire situation for the first 15 minutes, until she found a comfortable position, and settled into it with a decisiveness that her mother recognized immediately. They named her Lena, for Marshall's mother, and she had her mother's eyes and her father's steadiness, and from the first weeks of her life, a quality of paying attention that made Opal think of the way she herself had always looked at the world, which was to say carefully, and with the intention of understanding it. Jonas, who was 2.5 and had very strong opinions about most things, regarded his sister with the mixture of suspicion and fascination that was appropriate to his situation, and within a week had appointed himself her unofficial guardian, which Marshall said was extremely on character. The family on the ranch in the high desert fell into the rhythms of itself. There were hard winters and good summers, and one year a drought that was painful but not catastrophic, and the spring on the hill kept running through all of it. The larkspur came back every spring and Opal documented it, and the documentation became the anchor of a series of papers on desert plant adaptation that brought her modest but genuine recognition in the circles that paid attention to that kind of work. She kept teaching for 3 more years before she handed the classroom permanently to another teacher, a young man from New Mexico College, who was excellent in ways that were different from hers, and that the older students responded to with the fresh engagement that new teachers bring. She stayed involved with the school in a different way. She came in on Fridays to teach natural science, which was new and unofficial and so successful that it became the thing several of her former students cited years later as the reason they had gone into medicine or engineering, or, in one case, professional plant science. Eli Garza, who she had gone to Marshall about in that first November, grew up to be a doctor. She heard this through Hester in the letter that Hester wrote after Eli completed his training in Santa Fe, and she sat at the kitchen table and read the letter twice and then went to find Marshall, who was in the barn, and told him. He put down what he was doing. "That boy had it in him from the start," he said. "He did," she agreed. They stood together in the barn doorway in the late afternoon light, and she thought about the chain of small things, a conversation in a kitchen, a direct approach to the right person, 2 weeks of quiet work, a boy who had needed something to hold on to. Small things that accumulated into a life. That was how it happened, she thought. That was always how it happened. Tomas Garza had his own small ranch by then, east of his father's land, and was doing well by all accounts. He brought his family through town occasionally and stopped to speak with Marshall with the respect of a man who knows where some of his best chances came from, and Marshall received this without ceremony, which was how he received most things. The years in Harlan Creek became a decade, and the decade was full. The railroad came through in the early 1890s and changed the territory in ways that were complicated, and not all of them good, and Opal wrote about some of it in letters to Dr. Hartman, who was fighting similar battles in California against the kind of expansion that did not care what it grew over. There were victories and there were losses, and the land changed in ways that both of them had to grieve and then keep working anyway. But the spring on Marshall's Hill kept running. The larkspur came back every spring, and the columbine, and the evening primrose that bloomed in the late afternoons when the light was good. The garden on the south wall of the ranch house had been expanded twice, once when Jonas turned 5 and decided he wanted to help grow things, and once when Lena turned 6 and demonstrated a botanical interest that made Opal's heart do something complicated and wonderful. On a May evening in 1893, 10 years after Opal had stepped off a stagecoach in Harlan Creek with a firm decision about leaving, she sat on the south side of the ranch house with the evening light on her face and Jonah's, now 8, beside her, reading aloud from the botanical survey that Marshall had given her in February of 1884, which was held together now with a length of cord because the binding had given out completely. Lena was 5 and was in the garden bed pulling weeds with the focused, slightly aggressive attention she brought to most physical tasks. Marshall came out of the house with 2 cups of coffee and handed her one and sat beside her. She looked at the light on the hills. She looked at Jonas reading the Latin names carefully, making mistakes and correcting them. She looked at Lena conquering the garden. She thought about the woman who had written in the margin of a journal, larkspur, columbine, and evening primrose. The woman who had been looking for the place she was adapted to. The woman who had told a man on a first walk that she was full of restlessness and didn't know where it was pointed. The restlessness was still there. It had helped her write 4 published papers and fill 16 botanical journals and teach 3 cohorts of children who knew more about the natural world than most adults they encountered. It had carried her to San Francisco twice more, and through the hard years of drought and change, and back out the other side each time with more material and more questions, and the specific pleasure of a mind that has enough to work on. But she was here. In this place by this spring in this light. "You're thinking very loudly," Marshall said. She turned to look at him. He was watching her with the same clear, open attention that had not changed in 10 years, the same face that had been hers to read now for a decade, still honest, still warm, still the thing she came back to at the end of every distance she traveled. "I was thinking about October of 1883, she said. "About what I thought I knew when I got here." He was quiet, watching her. "I was so certain I was leaving," she said. "You told me," he said. "I meant it," she said. "I know," he said. "And then you planted larkspur," she said. He smiled. It was the real smile, the full one, the one she had first seen at her gate on a December night when she had said all right to a modest request for conversation by the fire, not knowing what she was agreeing to. "The larkspur was November," he said. "You didn't stay because of the larkspur." "No," she agreed. "But it mattered. It mattered that you listened that carefully." Jonas had stopped reading to watch them with the particular attention of a child who is aware that something real is happening, but has not yet accumulated the vocabulary for it. Lena had abandoned the weeding in favor of standing in the middle of the garden bed, looking at a beetle on her arm with the expression of a scientist. Opal looked at all of it: the children, the garden, the hills, the man beside her with his coffee cup and his easy presence, the spring just visible on the fold of the hill, where the blue of the larkspur was beginning to show in the late afternoon distance. She reached over and took his hand. He laced his fingers through hers without looking, just naturally, the way you reach for something that has been yours long enough that the reaching is no longer a decision. "I'm glad I stayed," she said. "I know," he said. "I know you are." "I'm glad every spring," she said. "Every year when the larkspur comes back, I think about it again and I am glad again." He turned to look at her. "Do you know what I think about?" he said. "Tell me," she said. "I think about that evening in October when you showed me the creosote bush," he said, "and you told me some of them were thousands of years old, the same plant sending out new growth from its center." He looked at their hands. "I thought about that a lot that first winter. About what it would take to grow like that, to be so rooted in a place that you could keep putting out new growth for 1,000 years." She looked at him. "And then I thought about the seeds my mother planted by the spring," he said. "She made something that could live without her, you said that. I thought about both of those things all winter and I thought, that is what I want to make. Something rooted enough to last and alive enough to keep growing." She felt the evening light on her face and the warmth of his hand, and the sound of Jonas resuming his reading and Lena explaining the beetle to no one in particular, and the spring just visible on the hill and the flowers coming back, as they did every year, as they would keep coming back. "We made it," she said simply. "We did," he said. And the evening came down on the ranch in the high desert of the New Mexico Territory in the spring of 1893, and the larkspur was blue on the hill, and the light was copper and amber, and the children were exactly who they were, and the coffee was warm, and the woman who had been so certain she was leaving sat with her husband in the last of the sun, and was exactly where she was adapted to be, precisely as far as she had traveled to find it, which was not far at all, and exactly far enough.